The title is A Bug's Eye View of History.
Thank you so much, Tom. I want to start out with a few background remarks, the first of which is, how many military veterans are here today? Wow. Super. And how many enlisted men? A few. And the rest were officers, yes. The talk this morning, I think, is rather pompously characterized as a memoir. That seems to me a little too broad, and that perhaps in retrospect I might have referred to it as reflections on my aspects of my life. This talk, and I've given a number of talks in my lifetime, but this I think is the first talk in which I am the subject rather than something else. My children for a number of years have been encouraging me to write a memoir. I did not respond, but the more recent requests found a more positive response, in part because 400 people like myself are dying every day, that is veterans, and so those of us who are veterans of World War II have increasing value in the world in terms if we have something to contribute, and the time in which that can be done is narrowing. So I decided to write something. I didn't know what I was going to write. But very quickly it was apparent to me that I wanted to write about my military experience. That has had a special impact on my life. That's what I want to share this morning. The title, A Bug's Eye View of History. Those of you in the military, certainly if you're enlisted men, and presumably officers as well, will know that you didn't necessarily understand everything that was going on in your environment at the time that you were engaged with it. That is to say that you had a very small piece of the action, and your understanding of the broader strategies of which you were a part may not have been a part of what you had. Certainly, as an enlisted man, I knew what my immediate responsibility was, what I was supposed to do, but I certainly had no sense, typically, of the context within which these activities were being pursued. It wasn't until after the war was over, and I read books about the events in which my outfit participated, that I really began to appreciate where we were, what we had done. And so I call this a bug's eye view of history because it's very narrow, very limited. In any event, with that as a background, I want to proceed. First thing I want to say is that as we think about World War II, it seems to me that what dominates the thought is D-Day and Normandy, and that people think of those events when they think of World War II, and not surprising given all the attention to it. I've been to Normandy, by the way, and that cemetery with 20,000 graves is quite impressive. I'm going to talk about the one in Florence, Italy, briefly in my talk. What I wanted to say about World War II, his background, is that while we were fighting in Normandy, while we were being challenged and challenging the German army in Normandy, there was another American army fighting in Italy. That was the Fifth Army, of which I was a part, and that there was a war in Italy that actually began in September of 1943 with the invasion of Salerno, and which I'll talk about in my material. That it's not clear to me that everyone understands that there was someone else fighting in that war beside the Germans as an enemy to the U.S. It was the Italians. Mussolini had come into the war quickly after the Germans went in. And just as quickly as Italy came into the war, so they went out of the war after when we invaded in Salerno in September of '43. With that, I want to say something again about introducing my military experience. I was drafted at 18. Everyone was drafted at 18. And so that it's always kind of startling to me when someone says to me, "Thank you for your service." Everybody served, unless you had some military, some health defect which would result in deferment. Everybody served. In fact, I tried to go to service on December the 8th, 1941. December the 7th was a Sunday. The next day, I had graduated high school. I was only 16 and a half, but I graduated high school. And on Monday, December the 8th, I went down to 90 Church Street in Manhattan, which was the location of the recruiting station, and sought to volunteer for the Navy. When I spoke to the recruiter, I told him I would like to go in as a yeoman in the Navy. Yeoman worked in the office on the ship. And he said to me, "Well, we really can't assure that you will get that assignment. Why don't you go back home and come on in when you're going to be drafted in a year from now, when you'll be 18. So I went home, and the rest is history. Went into the service I was actually into the service in March 15th of 1943, went to Fort Dix with a lot of other people, encountered accents that I hadn't heard before. And I will just share one term that I'd heard there that I'd never heard before. There was a gentleman, I think of Caribbean extraction, who was part of this little group that were having lunch. I still remember the lunch was a bologna sandwich, and he characterized everything as fucky, F-U-C-K-Y. I had never heard that expression before and haven't seen it since, but apparently it was popular in Caribbean law. In any event, I knew where I was going to be going, because before I was drafted, before I actually went into service, I and two of my friends had volunteered for the 10th Mountain Division. It was then just called the Ski Troops. And I had been very active in athletics, played a lot of ball, and so the notion of serving in a unit that had some athletic aspect was attractive to me. And I and two of my friends volunteered for what was called the Ski Troops. In order to get into the Ski Troops, believe it or not, you had to submit 3 letters of recommendation. And so we all went out and found doctors, dentists, lawyers, and other people who were respectable who would write letters on our behalf. And so I did. Later on, people were just drafted and were not coming in with letters of recommendation. And those who were drafted and didn't like the idea of being in the Ski Troops called skis torture boards. With that, I'd like now to get into my actual military experience. When I went in, I was sent to Camp Hale, Colorado, central Colorado. Hunters have been to Leadville. Well, Hale is only a few miles from Leadville in central Colorado. A camp at 9,200 feet, which was created in World War II. It had been a dried-out lake bed. It was a flat area nestled among hills and at 9,200 feet. It was at Hale that I learned to be a soldier. Though it was not camp, I had enjoyed sleepaway camp during my early teenage years. The outdoor life agreed with me. Surrounded by hills, always challenged to meet the generally modest physical demands and an early riser, I enjoyed the fellowship inherent in Army life. I was comfortable in my role as a rifleman in K Company of the 86th Mountain Infantry Regiment, one of the 3 regiments of the 10th Mountain Division. Later, of course, this is all being, I'll ask questions later, please. Thank you. Darrell, is it appropriate for us to stop questions at this point?
Rather at the end.
Yeah.
He said at the end. You want me to
Rather
ask
at the
you
end,
now?
at the end.
His answer was, it's better to wait till the end.
Okay. I was comfortable in my role as a rifleman in K Company. My most frequent complaint in the military, likely perennial, was being told to perform some duty by a certain time, and having done so, waiting to see its consequence, often much delayed. This is the hurry up and wait of military experience. Hale offered some recreational outlets. It had a gymnasium and a movie theater, but its geography was a problem for some. The passing railroad engines, the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad passed right by our camp, and by the way, it always had 3 engines. 3 engines, which gives you some indication of the fact that pulling loads at 9,000 and 10,000 feet required some power. At any rate, they put out a lot of smoke, and that smoke collected in the valley where the camp was, the valley, and producing a chronic cough. I didn't have that problem. My most frequent, I said that Hale had a gymnasium and a theater. My one major health problem resulted from ignoring advice of the medics about sitting in the snow when resting on hikes. Hear this, doctors, for your future patients who sit in the snow or wish to do that. We were warned that sitting in the snow could induce piles or hemorrhoids. I ignored it and wound up with the condition. When the medical officer looked at my rear end, he immediately said, "Hemorrhoids, surgery." I was operated on at Camp Hale Hospital, spent 2 weeks there in uneventful recovery, and was then given a 2-week furlough that allowed me to return home before resuming duty. To my knowledge, I've never had a problem since. When I returned from leave, I found that I had been transferred to a newly created weapons company, M Company. Very briefly, to understand the organization of a military division, division has 3 regiments. Each regiment has perhaps 18 to 2,000 men, and each regiment itself consists of 3 battalions. I was in the 3rd Battalion, I, K, L, and M, 4 companies in each battalion, about 160 men in each company, perhaps 600 men in each battalion. So when I come back from leave, I find that I'm now in M Company. And M Company was a weapons company. We were responsible for handling the machine guns and mortars, in contrast to the other companies, which were essentially rifle companies. I was handling a 30 caliber light, air-cooled light machine gun. I was the first gunner on that machine. That is, I was the one who pulled the trigger. Second gunner feeds the ammunition. I was initially disappointed at not being promoted during the transfer, but readily accepted my new duties, though I was quick to discover that carrying a light machine gun, if only the barrel, was not without discomfort. It was hard on the shoulder. The surrounding country always evoked curiosity for me. What lay behind the visible hills and peaks that surrounded us? I would sometimes use the weekend to take hikes into the back country of the Sowatch Range. Abandoned silver mines from Colorado's glory days were everywhere. These were just holes in the ground, symbolized by the Silver Dollar Saloon in Leadville. Acknowledging, by the way, with regard to Leadville, acknowledging its off-limits reputation during the war because of prostitution and venereal disease, when we returned, the 10th Mountain Division had an active veterans reunion groups, and I've been to several of the reunions in Colorado and then over in Italy with one, acknowledging the fact that Leadville was off limits during the war. And one of our return division reunions found a large sign on Leadville's main street. It greeted the 10th with the words, "Welcome back, we're not off limits anymore." Next topic deals with perhaps my most dramatic experience prior to going to overseas. It's called High Country Misadventure. Camp Hale lay near Mount Elbert, the tallest of Colorado's 14,000 peaks. Colorado has 50 mountain peaks that are 14,000 feet and higher. Elbert was 14,433 feet, and one weekend in July 1944, July 4th as a matter of fact, I and two of my company mates decided to climb Elbert. They were both rugged Californians and good skiers. I wasn't. I hadn't skied prior to going into the service, and interestingly, we had little training in skiing itself. I spent more time on snowshoes than on skis. But back to Elbert. The mountain rises above the tiny community of Twin Lakes in Lake County in central Colorado, about 20 miles east of Aspen and west of Leadville. We spent the preceding Friday evening at a small hotel, and early the next morning embarked on the climb. Carrying our skis, we moved upward at a steady pace until we had reached the tree line at 12,000 feet. At this elevation, there were neither trees nor vegetation, just snow-covered ground. It's an area permanently snow-covered, and this was July 4th, early summer. Once above tree line, each step became increasingly effortful, and I've never forgotten the painful effort it took to just make one step up at 13,000 feet. I had never been at that elevation before. We made the ascent in about 4 hours, 8 to 12, and then rested and lunched on its peak. The view from its summit is one of my own, quote, peak experiences. Looking out in every direction from Colorado's highest point, you saw only other mountains at lower elevations. It was as if you were at the top of the world, both literally and figuratively. After about 2 hours on the summit, we started down. The intent was to ski down to tree line and then follow the path through the forest to our base in Twin Lakes. I put on my skis but quickly fell on the snow-covered hard surface, and one ski slid away to timberline. Leo Miller, one of my two climbing mates and an experienced skier, took off to recover the ski but fell himself. His fall later revealed to have broken his leg. The third member of our trio, Roth, I don't remember his first name, and I were suddenly confronted with a medical emergency. We didn't know the extent of his injury, but it was obviously very serious, and he couldn't move on his own. We would have to carry a 165-pound 6-footer at least another 1,000 feet down the mountain and through a trail that we had lost. I don't recall who suggested it, but our skis became splints for a stretcher. to carry him, or a modified toboggan to slide him on the snow. It was exhausting trying to carry Leo down, trudging through waist-high snow and sinking into that snow with every step. We literally slid him down the mountain at a tortuously slow pace so that night had fallen by the time we reached our base. For me, it was the experience that underscored how people could fall asleep and freeze to death. I was physically exhausted, sinking into the snow with each step. This was time for snowshoes, but they were not a part of our gear. I disliked them anyway. On a few exercises wearing them, they were always falling off my ski boots. A real nuisance. They would have come in handy that night. Anyway, I reminded myself, as I lay in the snow thinking about how nice it would be just to shut my eyes and go to sleep, I reminded myself there was no time for melodramatics, picked myself up once more, and continued to help Roth get Leo off the mountain. We reached our base some 8 hours after leaving the summit, got to the hotel, and called Camp Hale. They sent a vehicle, got us back to camp. Leo was hospitalized. Both he and Roth left our company before we went overseas. For me, there were to be no more weekend mountain climbs. Quiet reading and a movie was sufficient recreation. Now I want to talk a little about my life with mules. This will be for most of you an altogether new perception of what military life could be like. Another feature of life in the tent was the risk of being kicked by a mule. What were mules doing in the tent? Well, virtually everything. We have an image of the military in World War II as mechanized, and it was. After all, Patton was a tank devotee, and all the armies fought with armor, but not the tents. A mountain unit cannot easily move on vehicles built for flat surfaces. And we needed transportation that could negotiate hills and narrow trails, and that historically has been assigned to donkeys, horses, and mules. We had mules at Hale. I saw them carrying cannons, 75s, but didn't get to know them until I had been transferred from my machine gun company duties at M Company to the 3rd Battalion Headquarters Company, about which I'll speak in a moment. This occurred following the movement of the 10th in June of '44 from the mountains of Colorado to the flatlands of surrounding Austin, Texas. We were from the high country. We were at Swift, presumably, Camp Swift, to obtain some joint training with mechanized units, but I never saw them. Shortly after our arrival, Special Services announced tryouts for a baseball team, either regimental or division, I don't remember which. As a former dedicated softball player from the schoolyards of the Bronx, I was an infielder and a pretty good hitter. This was just my cup of tea. Trying out for the team freed me from my machine gun duties and introduced me to other options in the regiment. Offered a transfer to the supply unit of the 3rd Battalion Headquarters Company. That 3rd Battalion Headquarters Company is the unit that serves as the supply for the 3 rifle companies. Offered a transfer to one of those. I accepted and found myself in the unit that handles mules. I remember being at a railroad connection at Camp Swift and watching mules come off a freight car. I soon got to know at least one on a first-name basis. I was now a mule skinner and had to learn the 2 knots that are essential to packing a mule. One is called the square hitch for a single load that you put on the animal's back, and the other one is called a double diamond for a pack on either side of the animal. Mules, however, are not like pets. Though I was responsible for providing food for the animal as he stood haltered in a small rectangular area with other mules on either side, I never saw any response at being fed. I might add that I've sometimes seems to me that horses don't often seem to show perhaps a lot of affection a response. I don't know. But Mule never did. I came to see my mule as not only indifferent to my attention, but potentially resistive to the demands placed on him. When cinching up a large saddle to which a double load would be attached, that is, a load for either flank, we had to be sure to make sure that we tightened as much as possible, because the mule would swell his belly, and then after we had it tied on, he would loosen up, and the load would fall. But my mule was more than just uncooperative. He and his fellow mules would frequently kick each other. They were standing side by side, and with hard blows they showed how strong their ribs were. But we could also be the target of kicks. One day, carelessly turning my back on him, he let me have it. A fierce kick to my rear end resulted not only in sharp pain, but a loss of function in the leg as I staggered back to our barracks. Like hemorrhoids, there were lessons to be learned in not taking precautions. Eventually, I became a seasoned mule skinner, and this was to be my role in Italy. Not many kids from the sidewalks of New York could pack a mule, a skill of admittedly uncertain value in my native environment. Recently, in reading about the settlement of the West in the 1840s, I found that mule skinners were in demand as wagon trains were formed. I was a late comer to that occupation. Now I want to talk about life with the mules in Italy. During the war, I had no idea of the significance of my transfer from machine gunner to mule skinner. It was the guys who handled the machine guns, mortars, and rifles who did the actual fighting and dying. My most vivid memories of Italy were walking my mule across a battlefield on the day after heavy fighting. The 10th had just taken Riva Ridge. This is February 1945, our most celebrated victory, and followed it up with an attack and capture of Mount Belvedere, a German stronghold nearby. The battlefield was a western neighbor of Belvedere and was the specific target of the battlefield, was of the 3rd Battalion, 86th. That is to say, we were supposed to get over in that area and provide assistance. The conquest of that area, which was called Mount della Terracia, the conquest was a bloody affair. The fighting area on the morning after, as I walked through this with my mule, was for me the epitome of carnage. Whenever I think of carnage, I think of that battlefield. I suspect that would be true for any battlefield. Its conquest was a bloody affair. The fighting area on the morning after was the epitome of carnage. Dead animals, dead Germans, dead Americans lay sprawled everywhere. Most significant was the sight of 2 dead Americans in a seated position slumped next to the machine gun. There, but for the grace of the transfer, might have gone I. I had no awareness that manning machine gun was any more dangerous than being a rifleman, but it was. The soldiers with the most lethal weapons would be the first targets for the enemy, and the machine gunner had to expose himself to enemy fire in a way that the rifleman could avoid. But we never discussed the dangers for which we were preparing. We just called it combat and looked forward to the 10th getting into the fight. That was, after all, the reason for our training. The infantry soldier tried to achieve at least some limited skill with his weapons assigned to him, though there was little practice in firing the weapons. On a single day at the firing range with live ammunition, I earned only the marksman badge, the lowest of 3 levels of proficiency. Unaccustomed to guns, I hadn't learned about squeezing rather than pulling a trigger. In retrospect, it is odd how little time was devoted to developing our skill with a rifle or pistol. Once my duties changed, I carried a carbine rifle, not the M1, and a sidearm .45. That said, once again, little attention was given to their mastery. Again, just one day at the firing range firing the pistol. It was the mule that was now the object of my focus. A cross between a jackass father and a mare mother, mules are considered highly intelligent, in addition to their reputation as extremely stubborn. Standing some 16 hands high, big animal, very strong and sure-footed, a fully packed mule could carry heavy loads over terrain inaccessible to vehicles. The mule could climb faster than a human, but descended more slowly, carrying hundreds of pounds atop a saddle that itself could weigh 100 pounds. They still had a role to play in modern warfare. And now I'm going to tell the kind of story that a fellow psychologist might enjoy. It was also my mule that came to become a major source for me of envy, jealousy, and rage. This was tied to my idiosyncratic eating habits. In the field, we were offered only two types of foods: K rations, which were primarily, I think, bacon, American cheese, and C rations, which were canned foods. The former, that is, featured American cheese. I would eat one or the other, either K's or C's, but would not eat both K's and C's at the same time. I would eat K's until I could no longer tolerate a K, then I would shift to the C's. Then I would eat C's until I could no longer tolerate C's, and I would shift to K's. This particular eating habit created problems because I reached a time when I could eat neither. I was literally starving to death while simultaneously being exposed to an animal that was constantly eating, grazing on the grass regularly and fed with hay. It was infuriating to see the mule constantly dining while I was starving. One day, while passing a field hospital in my state of semi-starvation, I decided to have them look at me. To my surprise, I was found to have something that merited hospital admission. That was great. Perhaps a digestive disorder. I was soon lying on a cot, a luxury to the soldier in the field, and spent a few days resting and eating whatever they served. Discharged to my company, I was back with my mule. However, my hunger had eased, and I could now watch the animal graze with relative calm. Next section deals with death. Earlier I spoke of death in connection with the carnage of battle, but another episode connected with death stayed with me. One night after fighting, the American dead had been collected and laid one next to each other along a path leading from the front line to the rear. While carrying supplies up to the front line on this path, I walked past a line of dead soldiers, and on a second walk noticed in one apparent movement, a change in body position. I thought, this man is still alive, and quickly notified the medics. I never learned his fate, but that night I joined others in the sorrowful task of carrying the dead down a steep hill to waiting trucks. Since the corpses were now all in body bags, I never saw faces or wounds. They may have been former comrades from K&M companies. I'll never know. Extremely heavy to lift and move, I simply slid the bag and body down the steep slope and let gravity do the work. It was not an action in which I take pride. I had no sense of the significance of the situation, no regard for the man whose body I moved. It was just hard work, and I tried to do it with as little effort as possible. Hopefully, someone, once in the hands of those trained for it, graves registration, they were handled with greater respect. Though not engaged in direct combat, frontline supply soldiers never are far from danger. On one occasion, as a fellow soldier and I were carrying 100 pounds of ammunition on our backs, shelling began that was noticeably near to us. We decided to take refuge in foxholes that had been dug the previous day. The holes were on a small hill on the downside from the direction in which the enemy was firing. Shells coming this way, we got on the downside and dug into the hole. Would the Germans use 88 artillery to strike such a minimal target, that is just myself and the other man? Why not? They could see that we were carrying supplies to the front and were a visible target in any event. We both felt protected by the location of our foxholes, and after some time, a few hours, the shelling ceased. Those few hours were my closest contact to the real dangers of a combat zone. An experience at Riva Ridge. Riva Ridge was a steep escarpment, essentially a cliff several hundred feet high, and called Riva Ridge, by the way. I suppose that a soldier at Riva Ridge is the one who named his horse Riva Ridge. Remember, she was one of the winners of a derby. I refer to Riva Ridge as the site of the 10th's most celebrated victory. It was a huge challenge, an escarpment several hundred feet above a small valley. It served as an ideal observation post for the Germans defending neighboring Mount Belvedere, their stronghold in the area. Riva Ridge was forbidding to look at and would seem virtually impregnable to attack. To scale it was the task given to a small climbing assault parties in the 86th Regiment. As it happened, my supply company was to be involved, and on the morning following its conquest, I moved up one of its narrow trails in my supply role. The return trip was not uneventful. Due to the steepness of Riva Ridge, the engineers had constructed a tramway from the valley to it. The engineers built a tramway from the valley floor up to the top of this Riva Ridge. I was asked to bring down a wounded soldier who was then on Riva Ridge. I was told to bring down the wounded soldier who would be carried in a metal basket on the tram. I got into the basket and the tram lifted off. Quickly, I watched the ground falling away below me as we left the mountain and traveled down. I hung on for dear life while I hadn't anticipated flying to the ground. The wounded man and yours truly made it safely down. Parenthetically, it was the taking of Riva Ridge by mountain-toughened soldiers that prepared for the victory the following day and the carnage that I earlier described. Coming to the end. Fighting ends in Italy. The 10th was fighting in the mountains of northern Italy, southwest of the city of Bologna. How much of us have been to northern Italy? Yes, okay. We were in the Apennines, south of Bologna. After Mount Belvedere, the 10th broke the German line of defense in the Apennines. The Germans had defended in Italy since the invasion of 43 by essentially east-west defense along the north-south Apennines, so that the Allies were always pushing against Germans who were in good defensive positions throughout the war. The bitter mountain warfare was finally, the 10th broke the German line of defense when we took out Belvedere and the German resistance collapsed. The bitter mountain warfare was over, at least temporarily, for the Alps still lay in our future. And I have never forgotten the experience of coming down from the Apennines into the Po Valley, and there off in the distance were the peaks of the mountains of the Alps, 100 miles away, across the flat Po Valley. The bitter mountain warfare was over. We were now in the great flat plain of the Po River Valley, Italy's breadbasket. We observed truckloads of German prisoners being carried to our rear. There was nothing in our immediate front to stop us. Crossing the Po Valley in a few days, we prepared to deal with renewed resistance as the Germans chose to defend themselves at the town of Riva. Anybody here been to the town of Riva? Anybody here been to Lake Garda, Lago di Garda? Okay, so at the northern end of Lake Garda is the little town of Riva. And that's where the Germans chose to make their defense. Garda is the easternmost of the famous lakes. You know of the Lake Como, Garda, Maggiore, and so forth, up in northern Italy. Access to Riva and the town north of Garda, north of the lake, was by two roads that were cut into the hillside alongside the lake. The road contained tunnels that the Germans sought to block with debris. Riva itself sits at the base of the Dolomites, and moving up the eastern bank of Lake Garda with my mule, we could see on the west bank a large villa that Mussolini had occupied. He was now dead. Along with his mistress, they had been executed by the Italian partisan resistance fighters, and his body hung in a town square by his heels. One often saw on walls, "Morte a fascisti." Our plan was now to attack Riva and follow the enemy into the Alps. This was a formidable challenge, but suddenly we learned of the unexpected surrender of the German forces in Italy. Some 1 million men suddenly laid down their arms. It was May 2nd, 1945. 5 days later, on May 7th, the remainder of the German forces surrendered. The war in Europe was over. It had begun in September 1939, and now, after nearly 6 years of unimaginable slaughter, peace had come to Europe. The aftermath. Given the attention devoted to D-Day and the subsequent fighting in France and Germany, we can ask what contribution was made by the Italian campaign. Indeed, after the invasion of Normandy in 1944, the ongoing Italian campaign faded from view and became known as, or unknown as, the Forgotten Front. In fact, over a period of 20 months, from September 1943, when we invaded at Salerno, to May of 1945, when the Germans surrendered, the 15th Army Group, that is, the British 8th Army and the American 5th Army, pinned down and diverted forces that the Germans would come to desperately need on both their eastern and western fronts. The ultimate Allied price in Italy was heavy. The dead, wounded, and missing mounted to 350,000 casualties, but the Germans paid more dearly. Though the 10th was a late arrival to Italy, in our 5 months of combat, we suffered more than 1,000 dead. I've described 2 that I saw next to their machine gun, and the one who I dragged and slid in a body bag. There is, of course, the remarkable American cemetery at Normandy with its 20,000 dead. However, in Florence, one can visit another and more intimate resting place for our honored comrades. They didn't have a chance to celebrate their victory in Italy, but memorials to the 10th assure that they'll never be forgotten. On the highway at the site of Camp Hale in Colorado can be found a large marble stone carved with the names of all who died in battle. I remember some with deep affection. And the war with Japan, though the Germans had been defeated, there was still a war against Japan, and we assumed that we would be a part of it. After 2 months of sightseeing in the area, Venice and Klagenfurt, Austria, were places I visited, and playing some baseball, we headed for home on a small Liberty ship. I was at sea in early August when news of a bomb circulated. Like the rest of the world, we had no inkling of its existence. Yet after arriving stateside at Newport News, Virginia, and heading for home, the reality of the atomic bomb literally and figuratively exploded. The newspapers and radio carried the story as America celebrated its victory over Japan and the end of nearly 4 years of war. Home alive in 1945 had been a goal, and the bomb made that possible. Following the Japanese defeat, the 10th was deactivated, and I was transferred from our then new base at Camp Carson, Colorado, to McGraw General Hospital in Walla Walla, Washington, and then shortly discharged at Fort Lewis, Washington. I made the 3,000-mile rail trip back to New York with changes of train at Milwaukee and Chicago. Arriving home just before Christmas, I was determined to do no more travel. Incidentally, crossing the country by rail from the Northwest made me realize just how big a state was Montana. After 6 unproductive months in modest employment, and aware of friends who were attending college, in 1946 I made the move to join them at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. That decision radically changed my life, opening eventually to undreamed of opportunities. I also met my future wife in Washington in 1952 and left D.C. to pursue additional graduate study in psychology at New York University, where I obtained my doctorate in 1955. Pursuit of a career in clinical psychology and a specialty in mental retardation, now called developmental disability, led me to move the family to Vineland, New Jersey, and then to Chapel Hill. Had I been less aggressive about a salary demand, we might have ended up in LA with my children, Marina and Roy, experiencing a California rather than Tar Heel upbringing. But I have no regrets. The move to the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, led to my textbooks and to some modest stature in the field. Hail and farewell.